Washington Post, the LA Times. It actually has 2 previous books before this one. And I should mention, in case you don't know, that Jonathan is a candidate for the New York Senate seat currently occupied by Kirsten Gillibrand in the coming primary race. So remember this. I think you are, in fact, our first to-be senator we've had in this forum. Thank you for coming through.
Sure.
About the book, I should say it's incisive, it's smart. At times, it's sort of ruefully hilarious, maybe inadvertently. Dark humor, if anything. And it feels like a really necessary distillation of some of the recent sort of economic crisis. And you know, with that, maybe the state of the country at large. I don't know. I hope you guys will join me in welcoming Jonathan Tasini.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. In case you were also fans of Mark Crispin Miller, I know there are lots of groupies out here for Mark. He is ill today. He didn't just abandon his post. He's not feeling well. So he left it to us to carry the load. So first of all, I want to thank you and the bookstore for inviting me. It's actually the first time I've been here, just because I don't inhabit the environs around here. I live in another part of Manhattan called Washington Heights, so I don't get to... Never been here, but it's a lovely store, and I've already bought a book, so you've got me for... I've invested in your own store. What I thought I would do is just talk a little bit about why I wrote the book, read a couple of brief excerpts from the book, and then really have a conversation with people, answer questions you might have about the topic generally, or whatever comes to your mind. So I actually started writing this book. I wanted to write a book about the so-called free market, which I had been writing about and working on for a very long time. It started out thinking about a book about the Walmartization of America, because I helped start an organization that was opposed to Walmart and what it was doing to the country, both from a consumer standpoint, a worker standpoint, and a community standpoint. And it evolved over a few years, and about a year ago, and you'll see this in the introduction if you decide to read it, I was reading the Sunday New York Times, and once a year the New York Times publishes a big spread, 2 big pages, of the salaries of the CEOs of the largest companies in America. And as someone who's written about labor and economics for a very long time and is a movement person, and for the last 25 years in the labor movement, the fact that CEOs are overpaid or paid a lot of money was not a shocking revelation to me. But it's a different thing to actually go and look at the numbers and go line by line. And maybe it was because I was bored that morning or something. I actually went down the list, which was a couple of hundred CEOs. I think they were all men, maybe except for one. And it was just astounding to me, the kind of wealth that they were accumulating, this small group of people. And it wasn't just in the pay, it was also in the pensions, which is where the real money is hidden. And it wasn't just the pay and the pensions, it was the stock options that these guys were getting. Some of the stock options were worth $1 billion for one person. And somehow it crystallized for me at that moment over the next few days that this had to be talked about as a metaphor for what I saw was a general robbery that had taken place in America. So I'll read just a very quick portion of the introduction which sets the stage for the theme of the book. The United States of America has just lived through the greatest looting of money in its history. A vast robbery that began in the late 1970s and has stretched to the present day. The perpetrators of this grand robbery didn't just steal a few possessions or a little bit of cash. Instead, they drained the economy of trillions of dollars. In the process, skulking off with a vast fortune that defied imagination, while leaving millions of people without jobs, in poverty, or without their life savings. It wasn't a Willie Sutton kind of robbery, with guns drawn and a slip of papers passed to a bank teller. Sutton, you may recall, was a notorious bank robber who lives on in the public imagination because of a one-sentence answer he gave to explain his particular strategy of making money. When asked why he robbed banks, he supposedly replied, because that's where the money is. No, the robbery I am speaking about was pulled off without a single bullet being fired and was, for the most part, and I think this is an important thing, this isn't in the text, perfectly legal. It was actually more like highway robbery, which the dictionary defines as, quote, excessive profit or advantage derived from a business transaction. Over the past few decades, a small group of corporate executives running mostly American-based companies have carted off hundreds of billions of dollars and stand to earn even more riches thanks to incredible pensions. This great robbery was ideologically enabled by a 3 decades-long flogging of a worldview that we now know is entirely bankrupt, that our society's well-being is governed by the free market. The constant rhetorical praise in newspapers, on TV, and by politicians of both parties of the free market ideology allowed for public acceptance of the robbery, as people were told that the great riches of the CEO were part of the American system of free enterprise. And if they worked hard and played by the rules, they too would one day become wealthy. Ultimately, the free market myth went, we are all part of the big picture of endless American prosperity. Instead of being based on any kind of sound economic theory, the free market was in reality nothing more than a marketing phrase, used to cover up the relentless plundering of our country's prosperity, which was in turn funneled into a small number of hands, creating the deepest divide between rich and poor in more than a century. So that is kind of the, if you will, the overall theme of the book. And I go on to then talk about, various examples about this. And one of the things that I want to be clear is that while there's a lot, I'm a Democrat, I know you'd be shocked to hear that, but I also lay the blame, if you will, the predicament we're in on the political system generally. And I believe, even though I am a Democrat, that people across the political spectrum have a responsibility to what happened. And here's the second quick piece I'll read, which leads into this. So there was a whole groundwork that had to be laid ideologically for people to believe in this and accept this. And it's similar to a con game played by hustlers in New York City's Times Square. A quick talking man will show you a pea, put the pea under one of 3 cups, quickly shuffle the cups around, and then ask you to point to the cup under which you think the pea now rests. Most times, of course, you point to the wrong cup. You think you've kept track of the pea, but then it's gone, along with your money. Actually, I don't think they get to do that anymore in the cleaned up Times Square, but I used to like, that used to be the real Times Square. Now it's all cleaned up and it's almost a mall, but that's not in the book. That's just a side comment. Instead of 3 cups and a pea, the people behind the looting of America have used a whole host of constantly evolving phrases and terms. Competitiveness, free enterprise, free trade, a global economy, to name but a few, to sell their ideas to the public, screaming and jumping down as they yelled at us through the TV screen, antics necessary to distract us from the deeds that were going on behind the scenes. They told us we were getting poorer because of government bureaucrats who wasted our money, when in reality, it was an unfair tax system that was robbing the government of its ability to serve us. They wanted us to believe at a time when corporate profits were soaring to record levels and CEOs were earning tens of millions of dollars, that companies couldn't afford to provide good-paying jobs to their workers. They told us that if we wanted to have a secure retirement, we shouldn't wait for Social Security or expect our employers to give us a decent pension, but that instead we should have faith in the stock market. And they said that we shouldn't blame the private health insurance industry, which was raking in large profits at the expense of people's lives, for the disastrous healthcare system. Instead, blame the poor and the elderly who use Medicare and Medicaid when they get sick. Behind all this shouting and misdirection was a singular ideology, market fundamentalism. To the pundits on television, the politicians in government, and the executives running America's largest companies, market fundamentalism was, and still is, despite the economic calamity of the past year, the great decider in all questions about the economy. For example, want to curb CEO greed? Nope. Market fundamentalism dictates that a single person can crown himself the most important individual in a company, worthy of a king's ransom, while his subjects, the hundreds of thousands of workers who actually make the company run, get pennies. My favorite definition of the term is this. Defines market fundamentalism as, quote, the exaggerated faith that when markets are left to operate on their own, they can solve all economic and social problems. Now, in this day and age, what I just read, I think, seems pretty obvious to millions of people, given what happened last year. And I, in the positive sense of this book, and I do have at the end conclusions about what needs to be done, I think the great positive thing about this economic crisis that we're going through, which in my view has built over the last 30 years, is that people's ears are open in a way that they haven't been before. That they are now understand that the idea that your 401k is going to protect you, that you're going to have a retirement that's secure thanks to a 401k is nonsense. And that the notion that there should be one CEO at the top who gets all this money is, I think, at the very least being questioned by lots of people. And that the notion that we should rely on people like Robert Rubin and Goldman Sachs and these other free marketeers, many of whom unfortunately are in the current administration, that we should rely on them to structure a fair society, I think many, many more people understand that that is not something worth trusting. And they're questioning that in a very deep way. The last thing I want to read to you, and then I just want to open it up to questions and comments. And by the way, if people do want me to sign books at the end, I'd be happy to do that. So, when Barack Obama was elected, I think that it was one of the great moments in my lifetime in the country's history. I didn't think I'd live to see an African American president be elected. And so it was an amazing, amazing moment. I actually was at the inauguration and remember the feeling of looking back at all the millions of people who were at the Capitol. And I was also thrilled to watch the helicopter leave and take the former administration into exile or somewhere, hopefully to be, well, I won't get into that. But I also, knowing that we got rid of the crazies, which was really important, people who had destroyed the country and destroyed our reputation around the world, not to mention led us into an illegal and immoral war, I also understood who I was getting as a president, and that Barack Obama would not be the president that I would want in all the aspects of this book, meaning someone who might challenge the free market as the thing that drives America and some of the more basic economic terms that we live under. And so this is the first piece of the conclusion that I want to read. When Barack Obama was sworn into office on January 20th, 2009, he stood on the steps of the Capitol and speaking to nearly 2 million people spread out in the mall, as well as tens of millions more watching on television and the internet, and listening on the radio in the country and across the globe, he said, "Our economy is badly weakened, a consequence of greed and irresponsibility on the part of some, but also, and pay attention to this, our collective failure to make hard choices and prepare the nation for a new age. What is required of us now is a new era of responsibility, a recognition on the part of every American that we have duties to ourselves, our nation, and the world. Duties that we do not grudgingly accept, but rather seize gladly, firm in the knowledge that there is nothing so satisfying to the spirit, so defining of our character than giving our all to a difficult task." Obama was certainly correct in skewing the greed and irresponsibility on the part of some, but unfortunately he got the rest of it all wrong. First off, his speaking about the, quote, collective failure to make hard choices implied that millions of average Americans had acted recklessly and fueled the economic crisis that was facing the country. In reality, except for the small, greedy elite that we have discussed throughout this book, most Americans have in fact been making hard choices each and every day for the past several years. Choices about what bills to pay and what bills to put off because their paychecks were too small to make ends meet. Choices about whether or not to take on another minimum wage part-time job so that they could put food on the table for their families, even if taking that extra job meant fewer hours of sleep per night or less time spent with their children. Choices about whether to raid their small nest eggs, money carefully saved up over years to pay for surgery or a healthcare emergency, or to just make sure there was enough gas in the car so they could get to work. The truth is that the overwhelming majority of people in cities and towns across the nation have acted quite responsibly, given an economic system that has, for the past quarter century, increasingly denied them the fruits of their hard work, while shoveling the vast wealth they have created into the hands of a self-selected few. So ultimately, if change is the buzzword of this American moment, we can only move forward toward real change if we are willing to first address the prime culprit for our current troubles, namely the culture of free market ideology and corporate greed that has enslaved this country for nearly 3 decades. And even if we focus our attention where it rightfully belongs, the battle to change this country will not be easy, as those in power have a powerful posse at their side. Politicians, media talking heads, financial analysts, all ready to justify the necessity of the free market, no matter its cost to regular Americans. And then I go on to talk about solutions to the current crisis. And I want to end that with this thought, because a lot of the book is tough, maybe harsh. Some of it's really, I think, funny. I mean, you can't not laugh at a guy like Dennis Kozlowski, who spends $3 million of corporate money, which he was then indicted for, to have a birthday party for his wife in Italy, the highlight of which is a ice sculpture of Michelangelo's David, out of the penis of which flows vodka. I mean, you can't think, what kind of demented person thinks up this kind of thing to celebrate a birthday of his wife, not to mention pays for it out of corporate money illegally. So anyway, there's some moments like that in this book, but the thing I want to leave you with is a thought of hope, real hope, not rhetorical hope, that because of the crisis, as I said in the beginning, that we face in this country and that people have lived through in the last year, I do think that there's an enormous opportunity for a different kind of dialogue in the country about what kind of economy we want. And I hope that dialogue continues, and I hope you get to participate in that. So thank you very much. And questions or, yeah.
Are you going to just mention a couple of possible solutions that you were...
Sure. The question was, would I mention a couple of possible solutions? Sure, I'd be happy to. I'll start with the thing that's probably most near and dear to my heart, which is I have been a labor movement person for a very, very long time, probably for the last 20, 25 years of my life. That's where I've put my energy in building a movement. And I believe unless we have a large, powerful labor movement again, we will never have a democratic society. There is no country in history, in at least the modern history, that has been able to have a democratic society, which in my view means where wealth is shared and prosperity is shared, without a strong labor movement. And it is the great shame of this country that we are now, unions represent only 7 or 8% of the private sector workforce. And the solution, and where we will have economic security, I believe, is where we have a stronger labor movement. And so there are specific things we can do to do that, to give people the real right to have a union. So that's number one. I talk about that. The second thing that I would say is that we have to, and this is a hard thing, in a certain way, and this is a tough thing to accept, up until this day, conservatism has won. And it wasn't just Republicans that adopted conservative ideals, it was Democrats too. It was Bill Clinton who said the era of big government is over. It was too many Democrats, in my mind, that made government the enemy of the people, when in fact we are the government. And what it did, I think, in doing that is it, first of all, made government the target, and it demobilized people, because people said, well, if the government's the problem, why should I be involved in elections? And why should I go out and vote? And why should I participate in movements and organizations? And I think that's something we have to reinvigorate and recapture. And one of those things, which I talk about, is to have a real progressive taxation system, which is really the way George Lakoff describes it, is it's making people understand that we have dues that we pay, just like you belong to a club, or there's a health club, or you belong to your church or your synagogue. You pay dues in order to make that function. And I think we have to reinstitute the notion that what we do when we pay our dues to our government, to our society, is we get in return. We get roads that function, we get internet systems, we get systems like the Securities and Exchange Commission, which actually makes sure when it's operating well, which it often doesn't, it makes sure that markets function well. You know, even if you believe in capitalism, capitalism can't exist without a government, because there has to be some regulation to that. So I talk about that too. So I would say unions and reinstituting a progressive taxation system at the federal and state level. So those are things. And just to go back to my other point, which is I think we have to stop, in a broad thematic way, we have to stop blaming the victims. The people were not responsible for this economic crisis. It was very specific people who did this. And we should be very clear about that and know how to solve it. Yeah.
So, John, two questions. Since Mark's not here, I have to defend him. Seeing your proposal number 6, campaign election reform, he would be upset that it's not further towards the front. So you're going to get some grief from him that it's number 6.
Okay.
He has a good point, though. Without campaign finance reform, no serious reform is going to get through Congress.
You are speaking to the converted here. I mean, I have run an election before, and I'm running now, which is not really the topic of this talk, but it is clear. I mean, you know, what I'm going to say is every single person here knows this. The reason we're not going to have a real health care bill is because of lobbyists and the power of the insurance industry. You just go down the list. And so maybe I picked unionization first because that's more near and dear to my work, but I don't see them necessarily as less important. But we have to get the corruption of money out of the political process. That's absolutely a no-brainer. And I'll say quickly, one of the examples is here in the city, is that when you run in the municipal elections, if you're a candidate, there's a public financing system that allows, for every dollar you raise, it's not total, obviously, public funding, but at least for every dollar you raise, you get $6 of public money. So it allows regular people to actually be able to run for city council and so on. Now, of course, that gets outweighed when you have a billionaire willing to spend $100 million. It's not a perfect system. It's just an example of how it allows real people to run. But I'm totally for public financing.
But number 2, whenever Elliot spits in front of the microphone, anyone who has the balls to put one in front of him, he talks about the real robbery here, which was not the bonuses, but the fact that all the TARP money was used by the U.S. banks to pay off their creditors, which were other banks, half European, half American, who owned their debt. And they paid it 100 cents on the dollar. So we're talking a couple of $1 trillion here.
Real money, right?
Yeah, real money. So if there was, let's say Team Obama woke up one day and said, okay, we're going to do the right thing. Number 1, they fire Summers and Geithner. But what would be number 2? And when I read Dean Baker and some other of the more practical economists, they have a number of proposals. They say, well, you could force Citibank, Chase, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo to declare Chapter 11 bankruptcy and reorganize. I don't think that's going to happen. Number 2, bring back the Resolution Trust Corporation from the savings and loan mess and do some kind of reorganization of the biggest banks. Or number 3, get all these executives together and say, here's your choice. You can voluntarily restructure the payment of those debts. So instead of paying 100 cents on the dollar, pay 50 cents on the dollar. So at least our great-grandchildren's money will go twice as far.
Well, first of all, I'm a huge fan of Dean Baker, and he's been a friend for a long time. So I would say amen to that. Let me make 2 other points, which is part of the problem, which I kind of referred to before in dealing with the economic crisis, is we had the very same people who created it looking out for themselves. The very same people created it looking out for the people they work with. Tim Geithner was, if you remember, the head of the Federal Reserve Board in New York. He was there, his people, the people he had lunch with, and this is the way it works. I don't know if he plays tennis, but the metaphor is apt. They were the ones that created this crisis, and yet rather than, not only should they have, some of them, been indicted and actually stood trial for what I think was a massive fraud, they just skated and they are still in their jobs. So that's one thing. Now on the bank thing, see, I have another view about the too big to fail. I think part of the problem is we have to break up the banking system and go back to communities, banks, and smaller banks. It's not just should we have saved these banks, it's what kind of banking system works and what do we have. So right now what you have is you have Citibank and those kinds of banks, and their thinking is what's happening around the globe and how do I move money and try to get just sort of a half a point like the traders do on currency changes. What we need are people who are going to think about what's going to happen down in Main Street when I'm a community bank and to the people who make loans. I have a person I just met who's a banker who says, and his family goes back in banking for a long time, he's embarrassed by what he does for a living. Not because of what he personally did, but because he can't actually go out in the public and talk about being a banker because it's such a black mark now. And bankers, good bankers, serve a very important function. They give, home loans, small business loans. So I think actually the long-term solution, which is not being talked about, is actually to break up the banking system and favor and go more towards regional community banks, not the massive international banks that I think cause this problem. And I think it's totally doable. It's all a question of political will. It's not an economic problem. It's not would they function. It's all about political will and power. I just here, and then I'll come over to you. Let me start here. I think I started, and then I'll come to you after.
I think I remember that same time zone. Oh, sorry. I just remember that what struck me was what struck me was that I thought that I read that in the past, like 20 years, the disparity between the CEOs and the workers here had gone up like 500 times their wages, whereas in Europe it was just 50 times. And I wondered, and I've also read that even in the other Western democracies, the overhead for healthcare systems, etc., is far, far lower than ours. I mean, with all this like talk and stuff, and I'm going to give back my salary and earn $1, that's just like BS. I mean, do you think what's going to happen to bring that back to some type of real, not just this year, and then 5 minutes later they're going back to their own business?
So let me address quickly the healthcare issue, and then I'll address the CEO pay issue. Medicare is one of the most efficient programs we've ever created in this country. It operates on about 2-3% administrative cost. Compared to that, the private industry health insurance is somewhere between 20, 25, and 30%. And why do they have those high overheads? They spend billions of dollars for one thing, to deny you health care. Now, what kind of lunacy is that in our society that we drain money for this express purpose of denying a service that they're supposed to provide, which is really what it boils down to. And the inefficiency of that, actually, I've had to debate these right-wingers on television a lot about this. They always bring up unions as being the problem. In the auto industry in particular, auto workers could work for free. And the auto industry would never have solved its economic crisis because the major issue around the auto industry is healthcare costs. If we had had a Medicare for all system, single payers, we call it Canadian system 2 decades ago, the auto industry would be thriving and be competitive. That's how outrageous it is that these guys denied us having a healthcare system that would make sense. On the pay thing, I've been ranting and raving about pay. I have a regular blog that I write every day called workinglife.org. And I talk a lot about pay, CO pay. And I think it should be reduced. But ultimately, they will always find ways around this. The only way we're going to change this is 2 things. First of all, there has to be a cultural change. And people have to be... until now, and it started probably around when Lee Iacocca was head of Chrysler.
Why is it so different in Europe, though?
I'll come to that. Until now, we held the CEO up to be a something to admire, and that they should get all this money. But it really was this is why it's not true in Europe. It was a self-feedback system. So you often hear, we have to pay the CEO a certain amount of money in order to be competitive in the marketplace so that we can keep and retain good talent. You've all heard that, right, and read that. Now, where did that come from? It's because they have this little circle of people that all tell each other that. And so they have the pay consultants who tell the CEO, the boards of the CEOs, that they have to pay that person in order to compete and keep them. And then it just escalates. And it's just this little circle of people. That doesn't exist in the same way in Europe. The other thing that's different in Europe is that it is a social democracy. And there is a much more of a sense, that, until now, and I think Europe is starting to suffer from that, the free market ideology that took hold here in the late 70s took a lot longer time to penetrate Europe. Europe is now, I think, starting to change in a negative way in that respect. And so it never had the same kind of pay the CEO whatever they wanted. And the last thing I'll say is, this is the point I wanted to make about CEO pay. I think the real issue is about labor, about unions. We can make all the changes we want and demand all these laws. You can have Kenneth Feinberg up there, the pay czar, telling people you can't pay people, and then we can do this and that in legislation. It won't work until there's power in the boardroom to stop that. And I believe the only way that's going to be true is when organized labor is strong again. That's the only counterweight on a day-to-day basis in the workplace that matters.
But also, real quick.
Wait, no. I want to give other people a chance. I'm sorry.
I do want to comment on your last comment, and that is, I was raised in Detroit, and I can tell you live the union. I mean, you're there on every strike, you're walking the picket line with your parents. The union really set the culture of that city at that time. The executives would not have earned those kind of salaries at that time, too. I mean, it just set the tone. The culture of the city was more controlled by the union than by the bureaucrats or the executive in, say, General Motors and Ford. But what I want to ask about is one observation I made is that I think that the Obama administration made a mistake in not indicting the neocons immediately. They have been doing damage to this country since the Reagan era with the Contras and all in North. Assets. We are not using it. We are violating it. We are letting these people, they are very wealthy, they're very powerful, they're funding all of these right-wing movements, and they're playing all sorts of tricks. So I think he made a mistake, the administration made a mistake in not indicting these people. Also, the executives of these corporations who fear being processed through the court system would really think twice.
I'm in 100% agreement. Unfortunately, the way it got framed was, I need to turn the page and we cannot be partisan, rather than it be about the rule of law. And what I often said when people ask me, I said, I would want those indictments and those people held accountable for what happened if they were Democrats also. And I think that's what the party should have said, that if a Democratic president had taken us to war illegally, and if they'd done all these other things, that person should be held accountable too, because ultimately this is about the rule of law of the people, not the political parties. And it was a terrible mistake. And I totally agree with you about the corporate question. When, in a little small way, one of the reasons we have, going to work is a very dangerous thing in the United States of America. Every day that people go to work, they get injured, they die sometimes at work, and there's no way the government can police the workforce given the task. The only way to stop that is to send one executive to jail for 20 years for someone dying at work. You do that once, And there would be such a quick change of culture, because the one thing they don't want is to lose their access to their Gulfstream jets, their fine bottles of wine, and so on. And I think this should happen too in the banking area. We have to send the people who can be proven to have done what I believe is fraud, send just one to jail. You would get their attention very, very quickly. And people fear that, it's kind of, again, on the financial system, it's because they're all the same club. It's the same coterie of people, and so they protect each other. And I don't consider this a radical thing. I consider this to be the rule of law. And if we are a system of laws, then nobody should be above the law. And isn't it funny that the Republicans are the ones that shout about this all the time? Did anybody else want to ask a question who hasn't asked a question? Okay, yes.
I'm going to try to make even Michael Moore. Market capitalism and the corporate monarchy going through kind of the back doors of the banks and the corporations. The first part of the question is, why do you feel that labor has not taken a stronger position, even maybe it won't be in our lifetime, to demand guaranteed annual wage, while all of this stuff kind of settles in a place where most people can even understand it? That's the first part of the question. And the second part is in developing countries where they're just establishing, like people with Mohammed Munoz, who are just beginning to create an infrastructure by property rights, enabling loans, enabling market economy to begin and expand. What do you feel the balance is in terms of what we have now, which is a disaster capitalism, as Naomi Klein says, and being able to survive as human beings, as so many of us, and either sell something, without this enormous propaganda machine, corporate monarchy, whatever you want to call it?
Okay, so let me try to answer. Those are both very good questions. They are probably each of them I could do it in a very, somewhat frankly, it'll be too general. So in terms of the labor movement, I think there has been always a tension between where the labor movement is on these big questions. And what I mean by tension, in some way, in the last 30 years, the labor movement has been fighting a very defensive battle. And so I think that a lot of the leadership and the structures of the labor movement were not capable and were not able to be flexible and, if you will, be more challenging. That when you're a union guy, I know these people, they're not bad people, When you're a union leader and you wake up and you come into your office and the first thing that's thrown on your thing is a contract that wants to take back health care coverage for your members, then you're focused in trying to defend that. And so and you can multiply that. And in this country we've had such a wave of union busting and such an intense campaign going back to the air traffic controllers against the labor movement that is just very hard for unions, and I'm not complimenting that, or I'm just explaining, I think, where the unions have been. That I think the labor movement has, and I'm making a generalization because there are exceptions, not provided the leadership that we need. But on the other hand, there's some great examples of how the labor movement has stepped out. If you think back to the fights around globalization, the battles around, the reason that we've been able to stop some of the worst trade agreements, in my view, is because of the labor movement. The reason we've been able to oppose some of the worst things that the free marketeers tried to impose on the country is really because of the labor movement. Barack Obama, again, with all his flaws, would not be president today without the labor movement, just in terms of mobilizing people, retirees in states like Pennsylvania and so on. So I think it's a long conversation, and it's a mixed bag. I spent the last 20 years being a inside the house critic. Loving the labor movement because I believe that no country, as I said before, will ever be democratic without a strong labor movement, and yet trying to figure out ways of improving it. So then the second question is, where do we get a fair economy, a decent economy? One is your point. We got to get money out of politics. If we don't do that, there's still going to be access to the most powerful people, lobbyists. You guys know all this story. I don't have to repeat it. Part of it is about having, again, a set of rules. We in this country, we are so trapped by these marketing phrases, free trade, free market, and people have been bombarded by this for 30, 40, 50 years. We accept this. And I say not people here, as a country, it's so hard to challenge it. Now, one of the things that I think changed, it was hardest to challenge it during the Cold War. Because if you did that, you were a communist. If you said something is wrong with the free market, immediately people would label you that way, right? Now,
Any kind of sharing suggestions means you're
socialist. But this is kind of my theme that I've said before. I think something has changed now. I think that that lots of people are ready to question the system that we've had. Because when you're the average person, and I mean average in the sense of not necessarily really politically active, but someone that basically just wants to go to work, do their job, come home, raise kids, maybe send them to college, and retire. When you've done all that, and boom, overnight your retirement's gone, it really shatters your frame of reference and shatters everything you believed about, you put your work into this country and what happened. And so it's leading all this shaking up, even the teabaggers, that slogan's been given. People are all upset about that. I don't actually look at that in that way. And maybe it's because I've spent my adult life for the last 20 years in the labor movement, so I've met lots of people across the political spectrum. And I look at the folks and I see the anger and why they're angry. We can say something is wrong, something's been upset in their world. And I understand the anger. Now, it's been funneled in a way and manipulated. But what I take from that is that there's this enormous opportunity, and the ground, again, is shaking. I don't want to be Pollyannish about it and say, all this is going to turn out well. Because let's say that the powerful are powerful and they're not going to let go. And until we end the corruption in politics, it's going to be very tough. But I'm also, by nature, an optimist. Maybe you could tell I am an optimist. I do believe in the power of movements. I do believe in the power of ideas and the power of justice. And I think that what has happened now is something that if we do it right, we can, I believe, capture it and change the country. I really honestly believe that.
Jonathan, do you mind if I ask you a question about the campaign for the state of the book?
If you ask it, that's fine. I try not to explicitly promote it, but if it comes from, I'm a free speech person. I don't believe in shutting people down.
What sort of opposition do you think you're going to be facing from Chuck Schumer and from his camp? He's sort of the famous mentor of Gillibrand to a certain extent. Clearly, you're a Democrat in the realist sense, labor organizer and things like that. Have you been welcomed by him and the people around him? Has there been a lot of tension there?
Let's see, how do I say I decline to comment on this without being... Look, well, let me put it a different way. No. I'm not. Let me put it a different way. In this book, you will find a chapter, I can't remember which chapter is right this second, which specifically talks about how we got into this mess, and it talks about the senior senator from New York as a prime reason that we had a deregulated industry because of the relationship of too many people in my party to the financial industry. And I think that's just facts. And I wrote this before I even decided to run. So that is, you can sort of read, the answer to your question is in some way in that book. I will say generally two things. There are some people, when Democrats run in the way I run, which is my political hero is Paul Wellstone, and I espouse the philosophy that he espoused, mainly that where he ran and where I'm running for is 30 years of principles that I'm not going to change. And so nothing, I think, changed him. And this was a guy who was the only Democrat running for election 2002 who had the guts to vote against the Iraq War, because his principles were solid. He said this was wrong. And one of the things about Wellstone that people forget is, he was the senator from Minnesota, which is not necessarily a liberal state. There's a lot of Minnesota, probably half of it, that's relatively, in the traditional sense, conservative, the rural parts. And he would get lots of votes from people in those areas because they believed that the guy was going to do what he said. They may not agree with him, but they felt like he was, to his core, honest and was going to be solid on his principles. And that's what I hope to do in this campaign. So it's not about opposing one part of the machine or not. It's about trying to connect with people and say we need people with principles in elected office, not just in the Senate, but everywhere. So some people are going to be happy about that and some people aren't. But I think there's a huge opportunity, because I will tell you that the general, the machine has not consolidated around anybody. There are people who support my opponent, and there are lots of people who are not happy about it, for lots of reasons, not necessarily all high-minded. But I think it's going to be interesting. We keep coming back to money. The only issue about this race will be money. Can I raise enough money to be competitive? If I can do that, I can win. And I'm absolutely convinced of that, given the moment in time.
Can you get on the ballot?
Getting on the ballot is easy. I got on the ballot in 2006 when I ran with virtually no money, and we got 3 times the amount of signatures. Building a grassroots movement is easy. You can get on the ballot if you work hard and you know how to build grassroots movements, because you go out there and get signatures. And we did it without any paid people. It was all volunteers. But you have to be, in a race like this, you have to be heard, you have to be on television. It is, whatever you want to say, everybody say, use the internet. If you don't have advertising, you don't exist in lots of ways. And you also have to put together an effective operation. So, any other questions? You'll get the last question, and I'll be happy to sign any books if anybody wants.
I just wanted to,
You have the last question.
to ask you. At a very particular time, it was a very opportune time, when the whole deindustrialization happening took the guts out of the strength of labor. I mean, when they moved like half of the jobs out of Detroit, the whole negotiation was, okay, let me save this number of jobs, and then they take more out. So they were always catching up. So I'm not a historian, but how can we, they took strong advantage of that. The unions movement hasn't been able to mount an international solidarity campaign. So how can you...
In the face of globalization.
Yeah, how can they really gain back the strength that's...
So two things I would say about this. One thing is that the laws union under the current system of labor laws. It just is. 20,000 people a year get fired for trying to organize unions. You have to have a system where people can effectively get the right to be represented by union. Today that doesn't exist. The second thing is, and I don't have an easy answer for this, is that if you look at the history of where labor movement surged and grew, it was connected to a broader social movement. So it wasn't just labor, it was, whether it was the civil rights movement or even going back before the war, it was just a movement against poverty. Remember back in the Depression, people were desperate, and it was a broader movement about trying to get the country back from the Depression. We, in the past 25, 30 years, we have not had a very coherent progressive social movement. It's been very weak. It's spouted in different places, but it's been fragmented. And so in the absence I do not know that in the absence of a broader social movement, whether the labor movement can be strong. Then the related question is, many people feel that the labor movement has to power that progressive movement. I don't have an answer for that. It's an interesting debate. I do think, and I think I've said this a few times, and with this I'll close, we are at a great moment. We are at a great moment that may not come back for a very long time if we don't utilize it. There's a great rumbling in the country, and you see it in lots of places. We have a chance to capture it, and if we do that, I do think we will change the country. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to sign any books if you want to.
Thanks everybody for coming out. Once again, we do have the book just up there, Jonathan. I'll stick around.
I'll stick around for it. Ooh, I gotta go.
Hang out. And do remember what's your blog again, Jonathan?
Workinglife.org.
All right.
And it's a community blog, which means you can actually sign up and post your own things there. It's not just me, it is me.
And of course, remember the name next fall.
He's on the board of directors. There must be a social safety net. There must be
Thank you very much for coming. Appreciate it.
Hi,
Hey.
just a few cute questions. One,
Cute or few?
few, and
said-
yeah,
yeah.
cute too.
Cute.
Do you think that, Mary, it's the New York bubble to think that there's a
Yeah, but the New York
People
Times worked
challenging
out their worker
the
things.
structure, I think, other than New York and Vermont.
Are you saying,
Like you're like, the country is really in a moment where they can, I appreciate your optimism, but I think it's, is it?
yeah, I'm not saying that it's all gonna.
Yeah, of course, right,
Because
exactly.
it could get people could get
Right,
moved.
right,
negative
exactly.
way. I'm an optimist.
Right,
So I think the
right.
opportunity is there.
Yeah,
But-
yeah.
So that's mine.
Yeah, that's,
Here's what
okay, thanks so much. And one more thing, why Democrats? Democrats are so disappointing, why do
Well, you know, I'm
Can you run as a
sometimes,
progressive, it's just not practical, is that the deal?
sometimes I'm unhappy about the Democratic Party in lots of ways, but it is the party of the people and Kennedy, and there are very good Democrats.
There are some good ones.
Vermont,
Yeah, we have a
although he's
great one, we have
independent,
an
that's
awesome
true,
one,
he's
yeah, he's
independent.
independent, exactly. But Leahy's an awesome one.
Leahy's good too.
Yeah, yeah.
Sherrod Brown, there's lots of good.
There are some
And the
good
fact
ones.
is
Some.
that, it's true. Well, you're right, look,
You know, so why?
because in this country, if you want to change
I know, that's-
political things now, and I can live in the gray, which is I respect people who want to do independent party politics, but I also believe that on a day-to-day basis, it does matter who's in power in Washington and around
Right,
the country.
right.
You know, it's
Yeah,
easy for
I
people to philosophize, oh, both parties are the same, but
Right.
it does matter.
Yeah, no, it does, it does, it
You know,
does.
and National Labor Relations Board appointees matters
Right.
if there's a Democrat. It makes a difference in people's lives. So I like to see things. I'm not a black and white person. I like to see
Right.
things a lot more
Right,
complicated.
right. I agree.
But
I
basically,
agree.
I'm a movement person.
But as soon as you'll get swallowed up by the, won't you? Don't you have to just party, all this party allegiance crap?
Ted Kennedy years
Right,
lifetime.
right,
And
right.
not everything,
That's-
but
yeah.
look at the. God, if I could be like this, like him, in terms
Right,
of
yeah,
influence.
exactly,
People
yeah.
who were elected were able to do stuff. Is it perfect? No. We don't live in a
Right,
perfect
right,
world yet.
right.
And I don't know that there'll be a perfect world before I die.
Yeah, I know, yeah.
You know, but you do what you can.
Yeah. Thanks a
Thank you
lot.
for coming. Email. You know, keep.
I will, thanks.
Do you want to sign books?
Yes, I will
You're
sign
gonna-
your book. And then
Don't run
I
away
have to
so
run
quick.
to another.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, I have to go to
I'm Guy.
Guy, G-U-Y?
Right. I'll be happy to vote for you.
Thank you very much. Go to our website.
It's in the book.
No, not in this book. Not here. I'll give you.
Put it. The thing you forgot to mention is in continental Europe, the union head is on the board.
In some of them, yeah. Not. There's more Germany. There's co-determination. You're absolutely right. There's a much more of a union connection there. That's true.
Got you covered, John.
All right, man. Thank you.
Send you a copy?